Okay, welcome to part two of Energy Systems, Smarter Athletes. We're going to talk about what's happening at the substrate level. Essentially, what's happening behind the scenes when we rely on all of those energy systems that we talked about in the first part. Um, this is definitely the most science heavy section that we've done so far. And I think that it is pretty important for me to tell you right away that if you don't have a background in biology, some exercise science, or some chemistry, this might be a little bit more challenging and difficult to grasp, and it might also not be very interesting. So uh, I would definitely think about that before proceeding with this. It's probably going to be about 20 minutes or so, and I think that if I'm being completely honest, this is probably a little bit more advanced level stuff for grade 11, grade 12 students interested in an exercise science pathway, and it is kind of talking about what's going on at the molecular level, and what's happening when our bodies ask us to produce that energy so we can perform the work that we need to perform. So substrate level energy systems, remembering that our big goal is to understand a little bit more about what's happening to make each system work and how those two things happen, or how those things happen differently. If we don't dig deep enough here for you, there are a few blanks that we're still kind of leaving on the page, please do feel free to reach out. Totally fine. I'm going to try to keep everything as specific to exercise and physical work as possible, and we probably will leave a few blanks. So if you really want to know more beyond what we go through here, please do reach out. No problem. Let's start here because this is familiar. We introduced this in the first module. We talked about using this chart to help us identify systems individually, their fuel source, their intensity, their continuous duration, tolerance. And what I really want to work on now is looking at that second column, that fuel source column, and recognizing the difference between what the primary substrate is, and not necessarily just what it is, but how our body goes about metabolizing what we provide it with is in a raw form to produce the energy that it does the work with, because that's the biggest variable here that we're working with. So you saw this term in the first module for sure. We didn't really go too deep in terms of trying to explain what it is. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is at the simplest explanation level possible. It's a molecule that allows the transfer of energy to support physical work performed by muscle. Okay, and this is in every energy system. Okay, so muscles need ATP to do their work. In order to contract and then relax and then contract again, muscles require ATP. All right. In order to produce it, it's operating in a cycle. Okay, so in order to produce the energy required to repetitively contract and then relax, the cycle of ATP involves ATP constantly being broken down and then rebuilt. All right, and that's a little bit of a difficult concept to grasp until I kind of show you what's coming up and what that ATP cycle looks like. Essentially, though, before we go forward, at an extremely high intense level of exercise, like an anaerobic process that doesn't require the presence of oxygen, we're kind of going into debt with respect to how much ATP we have available to perform that muscular work. All right, so keeping that in mind too. Our bodies store about 80 to 100 grams of ATP. This is a little bit more dependent on genetics and trainability. It's not a significant amount though. 80 to 100 grams of ATP on its own, if it couldn't be rebuilt constantly as it was being broken down, wouldn't be enough to do very much work at all. So not only that, ATP is not just responsible for muscular work. It's also responsible for a whole bunch of other basic cell function we're not going to get into here, since we're going to specifically speak to exercise and muscular work. But ATP is responsible for a whole bunch of other energy-related tasks in the body that have nothing to do with muscle, so it can't commit all of its store to muscular work. So although it's necessary, it's not the fuel. ATP is not fuel. ATP is a molecule that is being broken down and rebuilt by a process that is fueled by what we are taking in at the substrate level. So let's remember that ATP is constantly being broken down and rebuilt like this. This is a ATP cycle at the simple level. It shows what's called ATP hydrolysis and ATP phosphorylation. All right, so ATP, adenosine triphosphate, referring to the fact that there are 3 phosphates in that molecule, in that model. So basically the process of hydrolysis is one of those phosphates being removed, and that's at the same time when energy is being released. All right, and it's the re-adding or the phosphorylation of ATP, or ADP I should say, because it turns into a diphosphate, and it's the re-adding or the phosphorylation of that molecule, turning it back into its usable form, ATP again, that's constantly happening. Now, how this cycle happens is again variable by the energy system at work. So this is a simple explanation of what's going on, but what's going on is going on via different means depending on which energy system is happening, is being used. Let's shift gears for a second here and talk about what the role of ATP and ADP is in muscle fiber. Now, this is going to introduce something else new here called sliding filament theory. All right, now muscle fibers, again at the most microscopic level, have 2 types of filaments in them. All right, so we've got a thick filament, all right, and that is myosin. And we've got a thin filament called actin. And a muscular contraction involves the thick filament grabbing on to the thin filament. And a muscular relaxation mode, or when a muscle relaxes, it is those filaments letting go of each other. So the process of them grabbing onto each other is known as cross-bridging. All right, the process of them releasing from each other is when ATP is recreated by that phosphorylation method that can change depending on the type of cycle that's happening. And that's when that muscle fibers section, that those 2 filaments are basically put back into their elastic position, ready to contract again. All right, so that's in diagram E there in the bottom right. So essentially, ATP allows the thick filament to grab onto the thin filament, they attach, and then they detach when ATP is produced again, right? So ADP is the product of them being attached, all right? And ATP is produced or recreated, right? When phosphorylation occurs, they detach, all right? So you can imagine if ATP is being demanded at a rate that is higher than the rate at which it can be rephosphorylized and kind of reset, turned back into ATP, that what we would eventually end up with is a situation where we actually have a cross bridge happening for a longer period of time. And we'd like a muscle to keep contracting and then relaxing and then contracting and then relaxing, but as we continue to do more and more work, especially at high intensity, some of those muscle fibers remain in a cross-bridged state, even though we would like them to relax so they could get ready to cross-bridge again. They remain cross-bridged because there's not enough phosphorylation happening. There's not enough conversion of ADP back into ATP, all right? And that's kind of the situation that we end up in. So let's remember that this is happening constantly. It's happening by the millions, and it's happening in every single muscle action that we do. All right. So whether it's a big or small muscle action, whether it's extremely intense or it's very, very mild, this cross-bridging process of sliding filament theory is happening in the millions and millions and millions. All right. So why don't all muscle actions cause fatigue equally then? If what happens is happening regardless of how intense the task is, why doesn't lifting 15 pounds fatigue us the same way lifting 150 pounds does? Well, a high intensity muscle action demands a higher rate of what we call recruitment. So if I'm asking my body to provide enough force to move 150 pounds, I'm essentially asking more muscle fibers to cross bridge. All right. And if I'm asking more work to happen at a faster rate, all right, I'm asking for more fibers to go to work at a faster rate, I've increased the demand for ATP as well. And so if the cycle of ATP production now is inadequate, that means it's not happening fast enough to keep up with the demand for ATP production, we're going into debt. And some of those muscle fibers are remaining in their cross-bridge state, even though we'd like for them to release. We'd like for them to go back to being ready to cross-bridge again. And so at a high intensity, fatigue is actually caused by the fact that recruitment has been reduced. So at the very beginning of the exercise attempt, I have a lot of muscle fibers available and they're recruitable. And after fatigue starts to set in, it's happening because some of those muscle fibers are no longer available. They are no longer recruitable because they are still cross-bridged, because I've demanded more ATP than my body can cycle back. All right, so let's look at that sliding filament theory again, and let's isolate this bottom left. All right, the third step, when we talk about ATP attaching to myosin and actin head detaches, right? So ATP attaches to myosin and myosin head detaches from it. At this situation, this is what requires ATP. In order for this situation of, I guess we can call it reloading or detaching to occur, that cycle of ATP has to be happening. All right, so if this is happening at 1,750,000 times, but we can only cycle 1,742,000, every single time we contract or we make an attempt, we're losing 8,000 potentially recruitable muscle fibers, right? And those are just hypothetical numbers. I'm not sure if they're anywhere near accurate, but what we're looking at is a deficit or a debt that we're slowly going into. At a high intensity effort, ATP production cannot match demand. And so, as a result, some filaments are going to remain attached or cross-bridged. Literally, over time, less muscle becomes available for further use. All right. Now, this is where we can talk about why, we kind of go back to that question as to why not all muscular work causes fatigue equally. And it's because depending on the energy system at work, the demand and the rate of use for ATP compared to the supply and the rate of production of ATP has a totally inverse relationship. So when we're using the phosphagen system, the demand drastically outweighs the supply. And when we're using the oxidative system, the supply drastically outweighs the demand. So when we look at this inverse relationship, it almost begs the question, well then, why do we ever get tired when we're using the oxidative system? And this is where I can remind you that the oxidative system is the primary system when you are jogging, but it is not the only system when you are jogging. So even if we are jogging down the street at a nice easy pace, the oxidative system is the primary system, but the phosphagen system is still doing maybe 1% of the work, right? The inverse relationship between the rate of use and the rate of production is always based on the energy system. It suggests that only during the high intensity work, like the phosphagen system or fast glycolysis, should fatigue be caused by ATP hydrolysis or ATP dead or cross-bridging, right? And this is kind of the question that we just asked. So what causes the eventual fatigue during the slow glycolytic pathway or the oxidative system? And to really learn more about the eventual fatigue here, let's talk about energy substrates, okay? Energy substrates come from the fuel that we provide our bodies with. Essentially, a substrate is anything that can provide the starting material for a bioenergetic reaction. So we are thinking food right away, right? We're thinking an energy substrate can be in the form of glucose, glycogen, lactate, fatty acids, or even amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, right? An energy substrate is, yes, ATP or creatine phosphate as well, right? But let's think about the substrates that we consume as being these: carbohydrates, fats, or proteins. Now, our body relies on substrates. During lower intensity work, our aerobic energy systems get a chance to do their thing. This means that while we are resynthesizing ATP, right, it's fueled by the substrates that are most directly linked to what we're consuming from food. So during a low intensity activity, the primary source of ATP is carbohydrate and fat. All right, if I'm jogging, doing a quick jog or a slow jog, the primary source of ATP production, converting and fueling that ATP cycle, it is being fueled by carbohydrate and fat. Protein is normally not going to be relied on here as a fuel. It's only going to happen that protein is relied on for fuel if there's some starvation happening, essentially. Now, during starvation or extremely long bouts of continuous exercise that we don't actually have any refuel happening during, like something that's lasting longer than 90 minutes, we might actually see some reliance on amino acids for substrate level energy as well. But this would be pretty rare in a well-fueled athlete. So when we look at carbohydrate and fat metabolism, we're going to discuss this a little bit more in detail in part 3, but to give you a brief introduction, the contributions that come from fats and carbohydrates to provide fuel for exercise, they'll change with intensity. This is an inverse relationship as well. So during rest, an average person would probably produce 70% of the required energy from stored fat and probably only 30% of the required energy from stored carbohydrate. But as the intensity of an activity increases, so does the reliance on carbohydrate as an energy substrate, as fuel. Remember, proteins and fats can only be metabolized aerobically. If you've already seen the presentation on Nutrition 101, you know this. Proteins and fats only able to be metabolized aerobically with the presence of oxygen. So it makes sense, obviously, that fats would play less of a role in energy substrate metabolism as intensity increased. Right? So here's kind of another example of an inverse relationship, not too dissimilar to the one we just saw, when we talk about the fat protein contributions to the work effort, right? At rest, 70-30 in favor of fats, and at like a 60-second long max effort, we're probably looking at about a 95-5 relationship there in favor of carbohydrates. And again, this is arbitrary. It's not for every single person. There's no exact numbers here. But if we're looking at moving from rest to an easy jog, to a fast jog, to a hard run, to a 3 to 5 minute maximal effort or a 60-second maximal effort, you can get the idea. As we move closer to the volume of oxygen uptake that is our maximum, we move closer to a complete reliance on carbohydrate at the substrate level. So glycogen and glucose, these two terms that we see all the time when we talk about this kind of stuff, there's basically the output of what's happening when our bodies metabolize carbohydrate. So carbohydrates are broken down to provide glucose, which as a simple sugar provides an immediate source of fuel. All right, so this immediate source of fuel is supplying the cellular demand for energy. And when we have a short-term surplus of glucose, and let's think about like I just ate something super sugary, right? I've got a short-term surplus of glucose. We have more than we need to satisfy the immediate demand. And our bodies are going to do something at that point. If we have more than we need, more glucose than we need to satisfy the immediate demand, our bodies are going to start to store this reserve supply, and this is in the liver and in skeletal muscle, and this is glycogen. And our bodies will reserve supplies, and they'll kind of keep them there, and they're keeping the form of this complex carbohydrate, glycogen, and it's still very easily broken down. And this is going to be very easily broken down to produce that same simple form of glucose as the demand increases, or if the demand is no longer being satisfied by a simple sugar. So I don't think anybody has ever really done this, but imagine, entering some sort of exercise session with some sort of simple sugar substrate, and as you spend energy, replacing every single calorie as you spend it in the form of a simple sugar. All right, so if I was entering some sort of workout that was going to last 30 minutes long, and I started to figure out that at the intensity I was working, I was spending 15 or 20 calories per minute. So every minute I took in 15 to 20 calories worth of simple sugar. It would probably be a pretty terrible strategy for exercise. You probably wouldn't feel very good doing it. But if you were doing something like that over the course of the whole workload, there'd probably be a pretty low reliance on your body's glycolytic pathway to produce anything from glycogen stored in muscle and liver, because you were constantly replacing that short-term supply of glucose, right? Let's move into fats. When we look at fatty acids for energy, we have to look through a different lens. When our bodies convert fatty acids to usable energy, they do it in a different way. This process, the only thing I'm really going to ask you to remember about this process is that it is entirely dependent on oxygen. So that means that fat can only be metabolized during low to moderate intensity efforts. If you can use carbohydrate to provide you with energy for both, why should I have fat at all, right? That's a pretty common question. But you really have to think about the value of fats. And at the molecular level, carbohydrates are more hydrated than fats. And this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand right away. In a gram for gram comparison, fats provide higher calorie density than carbohydrate. And this is something we did talk about in the nutrition seminars as well, but if you haven't seen those, you might be learning this at the first time. So it is really important to know that a gram of fat is going to provide you with 9 or 10 calories of energy, but it's also hydrophobic. So if fats are hydrophobic, they repel water. So we carry and we store fat without the added requirement to store water. So fats are actually more energy dense and they don't require water to be stored. So this is really interesting. If we kind of compare this, it lets us know that we can actually do a bit of math here and realize that at 9 calories per gram and a water binding coefficient of 0, I can actually store 5,000 calories of energy in the form of fat, significantly less in terms of total amount being stored than the same amount of energy in the form of carbohydrate. Now, this is by no means a recommendation for a low carbohydrate diet. In fact, I would highly recommend the opposite. I don't really recommend a low carbohydrate diet for any athlete, but I certainly don't recommend a low fat diet for any athlete either. If we're looking at the carbohydrate side of this, we're looking at about 3.75 kilograms to store 5,000 calories of energy in the form of carbohydrate. If we're looking at fats, it's about half of a kilogram. So for some of us who do actually use and rely on that oxidative system fairly often, it makes plenty of sense to make sure that our bodies regularly store and use and consume healthy fats. All right. The last thing I want to talk about in this module is lactic acid. Because if I didn't talk about lactic acid, the myth about lactic acid would continue. And earlier in the first module, I did mention something called OBLA, the onset of blood lactate accumulation, which does influence our body's ability to use different energy systems for their efficiency. When we start to take on the onset blood lactate accumulation, we have less ability to produce ATP, right? Now, it's literally the moment aligning with a certain intensity level that your body starts to take on more blood lactate that can manage to convert it back into a usable form of energy. This is the Krebs cycle. We talked about how some of you would recognize that term, the Krebs cycle, because you've taken cell biology, you've taken some chemistry, and you recognize the Krebs cycle because you've studied it in cellular respiration. When our body is in a fast glycolytic pathway and it's starting to build up or accumulate blood lactate faster than it can cycle it back through Krebs and actually turn it into a usable substrate, lactic acid is the byproduct. Okay, so when we do those blood lactate tests, and we talked about them with the finger prick earlier, when we do those tests, those are tests that are just letting the athlete know where the threshold is. They're letting them know where the tipping point is between being at the slow glycolytic pathway and the fast glycolytic pathway. So this is really valuable training feedback. But lactic acid is the byproduct of fast glycolysis. Lactic acid is not the cause of your fatigue. It's there because you worked too hard, but it is not the thing that's actually causing your muscles to be fatigued. It is not the reason that your muscles are fatigued. We know that the onset of blood lactate accumulation coincides with the transition to fast glycolytic pathway, right? Or the use of an unsustainable energy system, for lack of a better term. But as athletes, we need to become familiar with kind of the borderline that is between the slow glycolytic and the fast glycolytic pathway, because that is our lactic acid or onset blood lactate accumulation threshold. That is our tipping point. And if we know where that tipping point is and whether we connect that to heart rate or power output or just understanding it by feel in terms of our aerobic versus anaerobic efforts, we can budget energy really, really well. And if we can budget energy really, really well, we can perform really, really well. So some of you may have even had this test done on you before, or you've at least maybe seen it done somewhere. This is the equipment used in a blood lactate threshold test. It's like I alluded to earlier, it's the finger prick test, dropping the finger prick blood droplet onto usually a test strip. The test strip gets inserted into this little reader, and the reader gives a volume lactic acid in blood in milliliters per liter. And what we're really interested in at that point is seeing when that volume changes. So in this particular case, it looks like the athlete probably is going to do a fitness test with a certain pace or power output have a blood prick test done. Then they're going to increase the power output, have another finger prick done, increase the power output again, have another finger prick done. And as long as that OBLA reading is staying the same, or blood lactic reading is staying the same, we haven't reached the OBLA. We haven't reached the threshold. The moment it changes, the moment it drastically jumps, we know we've gone beyond it. And therefore we know where the threshold is. Okay, that's a lot of science to digest for sure. Hopefully you've only kind of stuck with it because you are drastically interested in sports science pathway, or you are studying exercise science, or the teacher of your fitness-based phys ed courses making you do it because there's an exercise science component involved. If you have questions or you'd like to fill in some of the blanks that I did leave, because I know I did leave some, please feel free to reach out. We can definitely talk about them. My address is on the screen, and you can get in touch with me through the site, strongerbcss.ca. Thanks for watching.